This story takes place long before the invention of the automobile, or roads, or motels. In ancient times, people traveled or carried their wares in horse-drawn carts, driving down gravel roads for miles from one place to another. And carriage travelers, a nickname the ancients used to call workers who served as delivery drivers, would get so tired after driving such a long distance that they would always find random places to sleep and rest. This problem is being experienced by Joe Bates. It's been 2 days, he continues to drive his cart full of garden supplies that must be delivered to Red Springs, Alabama. Night came so quickly, and so did his heavy eyelids. The last thing he wanted most was sleeping and tethering his horses near the puddles. So he decided it would be better to find a place to rest for a bit, even if it was cold and rocky. Luckily for him, Joe ran into an old farmer who was walking home after a long day working in the fields. Joe greeted him and asked where he could find an inn. "Nothing of the sort from here to Red Springs," said the old farmer. Then he pointed down a dusty trail that separated from the main trail and ran through a thick pine forest. "It's a shortcut that can save half of your travel time. But I won't be going there when it's late." "Why is that?" asked Joe. The old farmer spat liquid tobacco into the bushes and said, "Because everyone knows that street is haunted." Well, Joe has traveled all over Alabama too many times to know enough that the locals often make up stories to pass the time. So Joe just grinned, patted the old man on the shoulder and said, "Thank you, old man, but I'll take the risk, whether it's haunted or not." Then, he drove his cart down that road. Several hours passed, and Joe was starting to think that the road was not too short to be called a shortcut. All he could see was a pitch-dark dense forest all around him. The light of the lantern cast eerie shadows from the damp pine trees. Creatures of the night rustled together in the darkness, as if waiting for the forest to swallow Joe alive. Finally, the grove of trees on one side opened to reveal a small white clapboard church standing alone in a narrow valley. The windows were dark, but Joe knew that maybe the door wasn't locked. After all, as the pastors advised their congregations to dare to pray wherever you are, even though it's very late at night. So Joe tethered to the front stoop, climbed the stairs, opened his heavy, creaking door. As it appeared, the church was empty, so Joe stretched out and lay down on a nearby pew as he chuckled to himself. He really couldn't believe his luck, to have found this place in the middle of a forest in the middle of nowhere. This almost made him reconsider attending church services every Sunday. But he immediately shook off that thought and fell into a deep sleep, and snored to his heart's content. Moments later, Joe was awakened by a sudden clicking sound outside the door. He paused and listened, making sure it was just the sound of some animal creeping in from outside. The sound came again, and this time it was louder. Joe reached for his extinguished lantern, but could find no match to light it. In his haste he swore, then he peeked over the bench, while his eyes adapted to the darkness. And as his eyes began to focus, he saw something that made him jump. A small figure in a white dress stood on the dais, rocking back and forth slowly on her heels. "Who's that?" Joe exclaimed, which was only answered with a faint groan. Joe found a lighter in his pocket. He was about to light the lantern, but in vain. When he looked up, the hairs on his neck were bristling as he saw the creature move closer. He could see the creature turned out to be a woman in a tattered white dress, her long, disheveled hair hanging down over her face. The woman moaned louder as she approached Joe. Joe stepped back toward the door, while he kept trying to light the lantern again, but the fire always went out. He looked ahead and the woman got even closer. So close that she could see the mud stains on her dress. "WH, what do you want?" Joe asked, his voice shaking. He backed into the closed door. The woman was getting closer and closer, her moans getting louder and louder. Joe struggled with his lantern again, igniting another flame. This time he succeeded. He raised his lantern forward, and gave a cry. The woman was right before him, eyes fierce and bloodshot, skin pale, and cracked like a worn china doll. The woman raised her hand to Joe's face, and Joe could glimpse her broken and dirty fingernails. Joe swung the door open and ran as fast as he could to his cart. He could hear the woman's footsteps dashing down the porch steps behind Joe. He immediately grabbed the reins of his horse and jumped into the driver's seat. And right before he raced away, he swore that the woman had grabbed him by the fabric of his shirt, trying to drag him off the wagon. Joe fled away from the church and didn't stop until he reached Red Springs, as the morning sun rose over the horizon. He stopped by a local wareroom, then slumped into a chair. With trembling fingers, he lit a cigarette and he caught the attention of the customers who were having breakfast there. "Are you all right, sir?" asked the stall manager as he poured steaming coffee into Joe's cup. Joe nodded and told him all about the ghost he saw in the church. The shop owner stared at Joe for a while, then sat down slowly beside him and said, "What you saw wasn't a ghost. I think it's Mary Ann Finch. The sheriff's been looking for him for days." His explanation goes on to say that Mary Ann is a young woman who has escaped from a local mental hospital. It seems that about a year ago the woman gave birth out of wedlock. Because she was afraid of being insulted by the residents, she killed her baby and then buried it deep in the forest so that no one could find her. But the guilt continued to haunt him, until he finally went mad. His family sent him to RSJ. But while he languished there, he continued to cry, said that she had changed her mind and wanted to dig up the body of her baby, who was buried somewhere deep in the pine forest, cold and alone. The problem was, he couldn't remember where he had buried it. One night, Dr. Mary Ann came to her room to give her a daily sedative. But the girl disappeared. Most residents assumed he had escaped into the forest, but no one was too keen on going into the forest to look for him. After Joe told his experience, the police immediately went to check the church, but all they found was a collection of muddy footprints. But Joe didn't stay long to find out more about Mary Ann Finch. He still delivered as promised and then drove home, vowing never to take questionable shortcuts again, no matter how much time it might save. And he also learned a lesson to no longer belittle the rumors that the elders might tell him. Because there may be a shred of truth to the stories, if you listen to them seriously.